In Victorian society, every action, word, and glance was subject to a web of intricate social rules. Imagine a world where the smallest transgression could lead to disgrace, where every part of your life was meticulously governed by societal norms. The Victorian era wasn't just about living, it was about surviving in a world where reputation was everything. People were constantly aware that their every move was being watched, and the pressure to conform to the rigid expectations was immense. From the clothes you wore to the way you spoke, everything had to be in line with what was expected of you. A single misstep, and the consequences could be severe. It was a world where personal freedom was sacrificed in the name of maintaining order and reputation. Now, picture waking up in a cold, perfectly ordered Victorian bedroom. The world outside may be chaotic, but inside these walls, everything had its place. From the curtsy you gave to the person who entered the room to the modesty of your clothing, everything was designed to maintain the high standards of decorum and propriety. There were no choices when it came to how one behaved, no room for personal expression. If you wanted to survive in this world, you had to follow the rules. The Victorian age, though advancing in many ways, was a time deeply concerned with outward appearances and moral superiority. Private desires were hidden behind the facade of respectability, and individualism was stifled by the weight of social expectations. This story will take you on a journey through the Victorian social structure, revealing the complexities of their daily lives. From the rigid codes of behavior in the morning, to the strict etiquette of social calls, and even to the rules governing courtship and marriage, we'll explore how Victorians navigated their way through a society obsessed with appearances. Whether it's understanding the protocols of formal dinner parties or learning about the pressures of maintaining one's status, you'll come to realize just how much of life was shaped by the need to conform to these societal norms. So, as we dive into the heart of this fascinating time period, I invite you to imagine a world where every action and every word could make or break your reputation. Picture yourself following these strict rules and living in a time where social reputation was valued above all else. If you enjoy this glimpse into the Victorian world, please like, share, and comment below. I'd love to hear what you think about the way they lived. Don't forget to subscribe to Soft History Stories for more captivating, relaxing explorations of the past. Let's take a moment to reflect. What would it have been like to live in a world where your every step was so carefully controlled? What would you do if you lived with these rules, knowing the consequences of defying them? The answers may surprise you, and I can't wait to explore them with you. The mornings in Victorian London began with an overwhelming sense of discomfort, one that would set the tone for the entire day. The bedrooms, typically small and poorly insulated, were filled with the chilling damp of early morning fog. There was no central heating, no modern conveniences, and the only light in the room came from the dim rays of the morning sun, which barely pierced the heavy mist that blanketed the city. This was the reality of waking up in Victorian London, where the luxury of warmth was an impossible dream for most. Instead, life began with a cold, dark room, and the overwhelming smell of dampness and stale air that clung to the walls and floors. To make matters worse, the mornings were marked by a lack of comfort that is unimaginable today. In an era without electricity, each day started with the need to physically light a fire, a task that required both effort and skill. The hearth, the lifeblood of the home, needed tending. For those who had the privilege of a fireplace, there was a constant need to stoke the flames to provide warmth and light. But not everyone had the luxury of a proper hearth, and those without it faced the additional hardships of a home that was not only cold but also dark. There were no electric lights to chase away the darkness, only the small flicker of a candle or the faint glow from a fire that was often more a necessity than a comfort. In the midst of these uncomfortable circumstances, the Victorian routine demanded order, formality, and adherence to a strict code of behavior. Each day began with rituals that, while monotonous and cold, were crucial for maintaining the semblance of order in a society deeply focused on appearances. The first of these rituals was the curtsy. Women, young and old, had to rise from their beds and immediately acknowledge the authority of the household or anyone present in the room. It was not just a gesture of politeness. It was a reflection of the rigid social structure that governed every aspect of life in Victorian London. This simple action spoke volumes about one's respectability, one's place in society, and their awareness of the expectations placed upon them. After the curtsy came the task of dressing. The clothing choices of the Victorian era were dictated by a strict adherence to modesty and decorum. For women, getting dressed was an elaborate process. Layers upon layers of clothing had to be worn to ensure modesty. But these layers were more than just fabric. They were a visual representation of the complex and oppressive social expectations. Corsets were tightly laced to constrain the body, and dresses were long and heavy, touching the floor. A woman's appearance was her most public attribute, and she had little control over it. The clothing was not for comfort or warmth. It was a sign of respectability, discipline, and the ability to conform. Women were expected to wear their modest attire, which signaled their virtue and purity. Modesty was not simply a moral choice, it was a societal expectation. For men, the process of dressing, while less complicated, was just as rigid. A man was expected to wear a suit, waistcoat, and a cravat, all carefully chosen to reflect his status. The clothing a man wore was an expression of his wealth, social standing, and respectability. In a society where appearances were everything, a person's wardrobe was their most visible statement to the world. A slight misstep in the choice of attire could lead to social judgment. Men, too, had little room for personal expression when it came to how they presented themselves. Even something as small as the way a cravat was tied could be subject to scrutiny. It was not about personal taste, it was about following the unwritten rules of Victorian society. These morning rituals, though seemingly mundane, were not just about getting ready for the day. They were a performance, a reflection of the larger societal forces at play. Life in Victorian London was defined by routine, and this routine was dictated by a system that demanded conformity. Every action, from the curtsy to the choice of clothing, was about adhering to the rigid rules that governed Victorian society. There was no room for deviation, no space for personal expression or choice. Life was about following the rules, maintaining appearances, and ensuring that one's actions were in line with the expectations placed upon them. The Victorian routine was one of constant surveillance. The way one behaved, the way one dressed, and even the way one spoke were all subject to scrutiny. One's reputation was everything, and the slightest misstep could result in social ruin. The fear of judgment hung over every action. This was particularly true for women, whose lives were closely monitored and controlled. They had to maintain an impeccable appearance, not just for themselves, but for their families and society at large. A single mistake in judgment, a single breach of etiquette, could result in being ostracized from the community. As the day continued, the strict rituals would not cease. Social interactions were marked by the same level of formality, as every word and every gesture was dictated by the same rigid code of conduct. The formalities did not end with the morning. They continued throughout the day. From social calls to dinner parties, social status was constantly reinforced through these rituals. A person's behavior, their speech, and their actions all had to align with the expectations of their class. The Victorian ideal was one of order, respectability, and control. Anything less was unacceptable. Yet, there was a strange comfort in this predictability. The daily routine, as uncomfortable and rigid as it was, provided stability in a world that was otherwise unpredictable and uncertain. For the rich, it provided the structure that allowed them to maintain their power and status. For the poor, it was a way to maintain some semblance of dignity and respect in a world that offered few privileges. Life in Victorian London was hard, but the rituals of the morning and the routines of daily life provided a certain order and predictability that people clung to. In a time when survival was a constant struggle for many, these routines were one of the few things that could be controlled. They were a way to bring some measure of order to the chaos of life. But despite the comfort that came from following these rigid rules, there was also an undeniable weight to them. The pressure to conform was immense, and the fear of judgment was ever present. Even the smallest deviation from the prescribed norms could result in being cast out of society. For those in the upper classes, the pressure was even greater. They lived under constant scrutiny, and their every move was watched by their peers. A single misstep could lead to disgrace, and this was a constant fear that haunted them throughout their lives. And so the day continued, following a strict rhythm of rules, rituals, and routines. From the moment a person awoke in the cold, dark bedroom to the final moments before sleep, every action was influenced by the expectations of Victorian society. This was a world where personal freedom was a luxury, and conformity was the price one paid for survival. Life in Victorian London was about more than just surviving the day. It was about surviving within the constraints of a system that demanded order, respectability, and conformity. Every action, from the simple curtsy to the carefully chosen attire, was a reflection of one's place in the world and one's adherence to the rules that governed it. As the first light of the morning began to creep through the small, grimy windows of her modest Victorian bedroom, the chill in the air was the first sensation she felt. It wasn't the comforting warmth of a modern home, nor was it the convenience of electric lighting or central heating that many of us take for granted today. Instead, it was a stark, biting cold that made its presence known before the eyes were even open. In a world without the luxury of modern amenities, mornings for a Victorian woman were harsh, uncomfortable, and full of routine. The first task of the day wasn't to stretch out in comfort, but to confront the cold. Her bedroom, far from being a sanctuary, was a space filled with reminders of the rules that governed her life. The thin, damp air seeped through the walls, and the absence of any central heating meant that getting out of bed was a daily struggle against the elements. The thick, heavy blankets were the only things that provided a small semblance of warmth as she pulled herself out of bed. There were no soft sheets to slide into, no mattress springs to cushion her, only the cold wooden floorboards beneath her feet. Rising from the bed was only the first step of a meticulously structured routine that would dictate her every movement throughout the day. The first order of business was not simply getting dressed, but adhering to the rigid norms that defined Victorian society. The rules that governed a woman's appearance were not simply a matter of personal preference or style, but were an unyielding system that dictated how she would be perceived. Her attire was more than just clothing, it was a social contract, an outward expression of her inner morality, a representation of her place in a society that valued structure, propriety, and restraint above all. The first thing she would do was attend to the fire, which was a task she had grown used to, though it was never easy. In an age when central heating was a luxury for the wealthy, fires in the hearth were the only source of warmth. Her role as the keeper of the fire was critical. If it went out, the house would be cold, and the family would suffer. To let the fire die was a failure of her duty, an error that could bring more than discomfort, but also the scorn of society. So she would make her way over to the hearth, add more logs to the crackling fire, and wait until the flames began to dance with their usual warmth, filling the room with light and a slight comfort against the chill. Once the room was more bearable, the next ritual was dressing, which was not merely a matter of choice or comfort, but one of survival in a society that demanded constant vigilance. The first item to be put on was the corset. For many women, the corset was far from a mere accessory. It was the foundation of her attire, the structure that would keep her form in line with society's rigid standards. Tight, uncomfortable, and restrictive, the corset was a daily reminder of the expectations she had to live up to. It shaped her body, but it also shaped her place in the world, determining how she would be perceived by those around her. Without it, she would be marked as unfashionable, even immoral. After the corset, she would don a dress often heavy, cumbersome, and constructed from thick fabrics that weighed down on her body. The dress was designed not for comfort, but for display. It was meant to shape her appearance, to communicate her status, and to reinforce the notion that she was a respectable member of society. The dresses were designed to create a silhouette that was flattering, yet unobtrusive, with layers of fabric that covered every inch of skin. Every part of her body needed to be hidden, for modesty was the highest virtue in the Victorian world. Exposing anything beyond the face, and even that was scrutinized, was seen as scandalous. Her attire could not just reflect her personal taste, it had to reflect her social position, her upbringing, and her moral character. As she stepped into her dress, she was also stepping into a role that society had carved out for her. Each piece of clothing, her dress, her corset, her gloves, was a piece of armor, designed not only to protect her from the elements, but to shield her from society's judgment. The gloves, in particular, were an essential part of the attire. A woman's bare hands were considered scandalous in public. Bare skin could be seen as an invitation for impropriety, a mark of someone who did not adhere to the expected social codes. Gloves were a requirement, an outward display of respectability. Dressing was not merely about protection or practicality, though. It was also an act of conformity. The Victorian woman's clothes were a visual representation of her submission to a system that demanded she conform to the highest standards of morality and decency. Every stitch of her attire reinforced the idea that she was a dutiful, disciplined, and proper woman. Her corset, dress, and gloves were her ticket to social acceptance. In a world where judgment was passed on appearance, there was little room for error. A single misstep, be it an ill-fitting dress or the omission of a necessary accessory, could result in social rejection or ridicule. Once dressed, she would have to ensure that her hair was styled appropriately, that every strand was in place, and no part of her appearance deviated from the prescribed norm. The Victorian woman was always under scrutiny, and every gesture, every look, and every word had to be in line with what was expected of her. This was a world where conformity was not just encouraged, it was demanded. Every action had a specific rule attached to it, and even the smallest violation could lead to shame and disgrace. When she finally made her way downstairs for breakfast, the day's routine would begin in earnest. She would sit at the table, eating her meal in silence, never speaking too loudly, never making a gesture that could be seen as unseemly. Her family, too, would be bound by the same codes, eating in an orderly fashion, never rushing, never showing too much enthusiasm over their food. The Victorian household was a model of restraint and decorum, where every aspect of life was measured and controlled. This was a life defined by an unspoken agreement to conform, to live within the boundaries of expectation. The daily ritual of dressing, eating, and performing the duties of the household was not just a way of life, it was the only way of life. For a woman in Victorian London, every day was a performance, one in which she had to play her role flawlessly, or risk the consequences of falling out of favor. In a society where reputation was everything, the stakes were high, and the pressure to maintain a respectable appearance was constant. As she continued with her day, she would encounter more rules to follow, more expectations to meet. It was a life of routine, a life in which even the smallest actions were scrutinized. Every detail, from the way she dressed to the way she ate, was a reflection of who she was, where she came from, and where she stood in the hierarchy of Victorian society. For women like her, there was little room for individuality or self-expression, at least not in the way we understand it today. Instead, their lives were defined by their ability to conform to a complex and rigid set of rules, all of which were designed to ensure that the social order remained intact. The Victorian woman's life was not her own. It was a life that was shaped and controlled by the expectations of those around her. From the moment she woke up to the moment she went to bed, she was bound by the invisible threads of Victorian society. And though the clothes she wore, the food she ate, and the rules she followed were all part of her existence, they were also a reflection of the broader world she inhabited, a world where appearance, reputation, and conformity were the keys to survival. In the Victorian era, every moment of daily life was governed by the strictest social codes, and social calls were no exception. A simple visit to a friend or neighbor's house was not a casual affair. It was a ritual, defined by precise rules that not only determined when one could visit, but also how to behave once you arrived. The very act of making a social call carried with it a deep sense of formality, structure, and expectation that many modern-day social interactions might find bizarre, but for Victorians, this was a natural part of life. One of the most important aspects of social calls was the time of day. A specific hour was considered the proper time to visit someone exactly 15 minutes past 1 p.m. This precision in timing wasn't simply a suggestion, it was a matter of decorum. The Victorians had an obsession with punctuality that transcended nearly all areas of life. Being late was not just a minor inconvenience, it was seen as a breach of etiquette, a sign of disrespect for the host. Equally, arriving too early could also cause discomfort and be seen as a sign of poor manners. The entire ritual of the visit was meant to unfold in a perfectly timed manner, with no room for deviation. When you arrived at your destination, you were expected to enter with the utmost decorum. In the Victorian social structure, physical contact between people was highly restricted, especially among those who were not intimate. Even in the most familiar of settings, where a simple hello might suffice in modern times, a Victorian would bow, curtsy, or nod. The rigid restraint on personal space meant that physical affection was rare in public, and any sign of familiarity, such as hugging or kissing, was seen as deeply inappropriate. These acts of warmth were reserved for the most intimate of family circles, not for social acquaintances or strangers. Instead of a friendly embrace, guests were required to make their presence known through a more formalized process. The most essential aspect of a Victorian social call was the exchange of calling cards. Upon arrival, it was customary to hand over your calling card to the servant who opened the door. This small gesture was a symbol of your respect for the household, signaling that you had arrived in accordance with social norms. The calling card was not just a piece of paper. It was a key to entering the world of polite society, a way of acknowledging the household status and your place within that world. The card itself was often elegantly designed, with intricate script that conveyed your family's name, social status, and sometimes even your title. It was part of the unspoken language of Victorian etiquette, providing a written marker of your identity, which then dictated the nature of the visit. Only one visit could be made in a single day, and once the card was handed over, the conversation would follow its own formal rhythm, much like the structured world of the court. Small talk, carefully chosen, and thoroughly mundane, dominated these visits. Subjects like the weather, the latest sermon at church, or the state of local affairs were the only safe topics for discussion. Deeper, personal subjects were off limits, as revealing too much emotion or discussing uncomfortable topics was seen as a breach of good taste. The visit itself would often be short, lasting no more than 15 minutes. Any attempt to extend the visit beyond that time frame would be considered rude, even presumptuous. After the allotted time, it was expected that you would take your leave, offering a polite farewell and exiting just as gracefully as you had entered. These interactions were meant to follow a strict and predictable pattern, allowing individuals to maintain the rigid separation of social classes while fostering a sense of order and respect. Victorian social calls were a reflection of the larger social structure of the time. The rules of behavior extended beyond the individual to encompass families, communities, and even the way the larger society functioned. In a world where reputation was everything, where a single misstep could result in disgrace, these calls were not just about maintaining relationships, but about preserving one's place within the social hierarchy. Each social interaction, no matter how brief, was an opportunity to demonstrate adherence to the rules, to show that you understood your role in the delicate fabric of Victorian society. These highly regulated social norms extended beyond just the formal visit itself. The way you dressed, the way you spoke, and even the way you sat or stood were all subject to intense scrutiny. Social calls weren't just a matter of visiting for the sake of company, they were carefully constructed events designed to communicate your social standing, your respectability, and your ability to follow the rules. Every small gesture, whether it was the way you greeted the hostess or the manner in which you positioned yourself within the room, had its own set of expectations and codes to follow. A misstep, a glance that lasted too long, or an overly enthusiastic greeting could mark you as a person of low breeding, or worse, an outsider to proper Victorian society. In the larger context, social calls and their associated etiquette were a reflection of the strict societal boundaries that defined the Victorian era. The class system was rigid, with little room for movement between social strata. Victorian society was deeply hierarchical, and social calls provided a means of reinforcing these boundaries. They were not just a polite formality, but a reinforcement of the system that kept individuals in their prescribed roles. Every act, every word, every gesture had a purpose in maintaining this order, from the carefully chosen subjects of conversation to the exacting timing of the visit. The expectations surrounding these calls were particularly pronounced for women, whose role in society was circumscribed by an unyielding set of rules. Women were expected to behave with the utmost decorum, and their interactions with others had to be carefully controlled. A woman's reputation was often built on her ability to conform to these rules, and her ability to maintain her social standing depended on her mastery of these subtle gestures. The decorum surrounding social calls ensured that women remained within the safe bounds of their prescribed role, never too forward, never too relaxed, always on display for scrutiny. For men, while the rules of behavior were similarly stringent, there was often more room for deviation. The expectations for men's conduct were focused more on their ability to display control and restraint rather than rigidly adhering to particular forms of etiquette. Nonetheless, a man's behavior during social calls had just as much potential for affecting his reputation. Men were expected to navigate the complex web of societal expectations with just as much care as women, but their position often allowed them more leeway in how they conducted themselves. The importance of these social calls in Victorian life cannot be overstated. They were an essential part of the social fabric that bound people together, even as they kept them apart. They allowed people to maintain a sense of propriety, to define and reaffirm their social standing, and to engage in the intricate dance of maintaining one's position in a society obsessed with appearances and reputation. These calls were not simply about socializing or friendship. They were about survival within a highly structured world that demanded the utmost in decorum, modesty, and restraint. Social calls during the Victorian era were not just routine social visits, but intricate performances governed by strict codes of behavior. Every detail of the visit, from the time of arrival to the manner of departure, was dictated by a system that valued order, restraint, and control. It was a world where the smallest deviation from the rules could lead to social ruin, and every interaction was an opportunity to affirm one's place within that rigid framework. The world of Victorian social calls was, at its core, a reflection of a society that valued appearances above all else and demanded conformity in every aspect of life. In Victorian society, every social interaction was governed by an intricate web of rules and expectations. Even the most ordinary of conversations were fraught with the need for careful consideration. Conversations in this world, far from the casual, free-flowing exchanges we are accustomed to today, were constrained by a rigid set of guidelines. The rules were clear. Subjects of conversation had to remain within acceptable bounds, and emotions, particularly strong ones, had to be kept firmly in check. To understand the way Victorians spoke and interacted with one another, one must first comprehend the value placed on discretion, propriety, and emotional restraint. The Victorians, often seen as the epitome of restraint and politeness, cultivated an environment where the topics one could discuss were carefully circumscribed. Public conversation was restricted to safe subjects, topics that were unlikely to cause offense or stir up strong emotions. These topics included discussions about church sermons, the latest in music, or even politics, but always within a narrow, structured framework. Talking about personal matters or displaying personal opinions outside of these well-established boundaries was a dangerous game. Deviating from these themes, especially in public or formal settings, could lead to discomfort or awkward silence. It could even jeopardize one's reputation, something of utmost importance in Victorian society. The concept of privacy and the delicate balance of maintaining respectability meant that certain matters, such as financial troubles, marital disputes, or any personal hardship, were never aired in public conversation. To share such private matters was seen as vulgar or undignified. The most crucial skill in these interactions was the ability to remain aloof and composed, no matter the circumstances. Expressing strong emotions was simply not acceptable. Whether it was excitement, joy, or sorrow, any emotional display was seen as a breach of decorum. Victorians were expected to maintain a facade of calm at all times. A raised voice, a sudden burst of laughter, or even an overly enthusiastic response was viewed as a sign of poor upbringing or a lack of self-control. To be too passionate about any subject was to lose control, and losing control was an unforgivable social misstep. People were expected to speak in a measured tone, with a calm demeanor, even when discussing topics that might evoke deep personal feelings or opinions. The subtlety of language played an important role in Victorian conversations. Words had to be chosen carefully, and tones must never betray too much emotion. For instance, when discussing a concert one had attended, a Victorian might comment on the technical prowess of the musicians or the eloquence of the conductor, but would steer clear of expressing any personal enthusiasm or any overly emotional reaction to the performance. To express too much excitement about the music would risk being seen as overly effusive or undignified. Eye contact was another subtle but vital part of Victorian interaction. While important, it had to be measured and discreet. Direct, prolonged eye contact was considered inappropriate, suggesting that one was overly bold or intrusive. A glance, a polite acknowledgement, was the proper way to show attentiveness and respect. In formal settings, prolonged eye contact could signal aggression or intimacy, both of which were highly undesirable in public discourse. The gaze of a Victorian was supposed to be polite, respectful, and always under control. Even the most intimate relationships were subject to these rules. A Victorian couple, for instance, might show affection in private, but in public, any signs of tenderness, be it a touch of the hand, a meaningful glance, or even a soft smile, were to be kept to a minimum. Victorian society was a world built on the delicate balancing of appearances and the regulation of emotions. Conversations were not an opportunity for individuals to express themselves freely, but rather a forum for maintaining social order and hierarchy. A slight breach of these conversational norms could lead to social ostracism. If a person became too animated during a discussion or failed to adhere to the prescribed topics, they might be regarded as unrefined or improper. Such behavior could lead to gossip. And in a society where one's reputation was everything, gossip could be more damaging than any public scandal. The importance of maintaining a certain level of decorum in conversation was not just about adhering to social norms. It was also a reflection of Victorian values regarding self-control and propriety. To reveal too much of oneself, to express too much joy or sadness, to allow one's voice to rise above a certain pitch, or to discuss uncomfortable subjects was to fail in the eyes of society. It was to admit, in some ways, that one was not fully in command of one's emotions, and that was something Victorians would simply not tolerate. Social gatherings, from formal dinners to afternoon teas, were the setting in which these rules played out. During these events, Victorians gathered in tight, meticulously curated circles where every conversation was carefully moderated and every participant's behavior was scrutinized. A conversation, especially with someone of higher social status, could be a minefield of expectations. The wrong choice of topic, the wrong tone of voice, or even the wrong expression could lead to social disaster. It was not enough to simply avoid rudeness. One had to avoid any behavior that might be interpreted as unrefined or unpolished. Social grace was not merely an art form but a moral imperative, and those who mastered it were rewarded with acceptance in the circles that mattered. Victorian conversations, in their very structure, highlighted the societal pressure to maintain control. At times, this pressure manifested as a quiet, pervasive tension. Even the smallest social gathering was fraught with rules governing conversation, rules that placed value on subtlety over expression, on reserve over exuberance. This culture of restraint extended beyond just the words spoken. Body language, posture, and the handling of silences were just as important. A well-placed pause could speak volumes, while an untimely word might cause irreversible damage to a person's social standing. Yet, amid these rigid social constructs, there was also a recognition that these conventions were not necessarily burdensome for everyone. For many, They provided structure in a world that otherwise lacked certainty. In a time of rapid industrialization, political upheaval, and social change, the rules of Victorian conversation offered a sense of continuity, a stable framework in which to navigate the complexities of daily life. By adhering to these norms, Victorians not only preserved their social standing, but also expressed their belonging within the broader cultural fabric of the era. For the Victorians, conversations were far more than just exchanges of words. They were the means by which one could secure their place in society, demonstrating not only intelligence and refinement, but also an understanding of the delicate balance required to maintain respect and status. Every word, every gesture, every glance was part of a much larger narrative about who they were, how they were seen, and where they fit into the intricate web of Victorian society. In this world, the art of conversation was not about expressing oneself freely, but about carefully sculpting one's public persona. Every sentence, every pause, every glance was a tool in maintaining the social harmony that defined the era. The cost of failure, however, could be steep social embarrassment, ostracism, and even ruin for those who dared to transgress. To live within the confines of Victorian norms was to live a life of perpetual performance. Courtship in Victorian society was a ritual that went far beyond simple affection. It was an institution, a slow, calculated process where every interaction between potential suitors was loaded with expectation, formality, and often family oversight. For the unmarried women, courtship wasn't just about finding a partner, it was a reflection of their character, their family's standing, and their place in society. A woman's reputation was everything, and any misstep could damage not only her future prospects, but also her family's. At the very heart of Victorian courtship lay the rules. Courtship was not about spontaneity or informal interactions. Instead, it was a formal, regulated process, bound by a strict code of conduct. Each movement, each glance, each word spoken in the context of courtship was carefully choreographed, ensuring that any romantic engagement adhered to societal standards and expectations. Nothing about courtship was left to chance. In many ways, it was a performance, a display, not of raw emotion, but of propriety and restraint. One of the central aspects of Victorian courtship was the role of the chaperone. Women, especially those from respectable families, were never allowed to meet a suitor alone. A chaperone, often a mother, sister, or trusted companion, was present at every meeting, ensuring that no unsupervised intimacy or inappropriate behavior could take place. This system existed to safeguard the reputation of the woman and, by extension, her family. The presence of a chaperone was a constant reminder that nothing could happen without the approval of the family and society at large. There was no such thing as private courtship. Even the most innocent meeting could be misconstrued if not conducted in the right environment, under the watchful eye of a third party. Public displays of affection, which are common today, were strictly forbidden. The act of holding hands, kissing, or any other display of romantic affection in public was not only frowned upon but was considered scandalous. Such public gestures were considered too forward, a sign of low morals or poor upbringing. Affection was something to be hidden, even from the most intimate circles, and was confined to private spaces, only to be discussed with family or close friends in the right setting. Instead, courtship was about decorum and reserve. For a woman, demonstrating attraction or eagerness was a serious social faux pas. Any outward display of affection could be misinterpreted as desperation, and no respectable woman would want that to tarnish her name. A man, on the other hand, had to navigate a series of social expectations in his pursuit of a woman's affections. His interest in a woman was expected to be serious and deliberate. For him, courtship was not just about emotion, it was about proving his worth and his suitability as a potential match. Victorians viewed marriage as an institution, not a romantic adventure, and therefore a man's pursuit of a woman was akin to a business transaction, where mutual respect, good intentions, and financial stability were just as important as love. This required careful and deliberate steps. Before proposing, a man needed to seek approval from the woman's family. His desire to marry her had to be measured and shown in an appropriate way. He could not simply approach the woman and express his feelings. He had to demonstrate his seriousness and prove his worth in the eyes of her family. A proposal without prior permission was a violation of this sacred process. Music performances, particularly those involving the woman, were a key feature of Victorian courtship rituals. These performances were more than just a display of talent. They were a way for a woman to demonstrate her accomplishments, her education, and her place in society. She was expected to be skilled in playing an instrument, singing, or performing other genteel activities. A woman's ability to play the piano or sing was a sign of refinement and accomplishment, but at the same time, she had to show restraint. Even while performing, she had to be careful not to appear too eager or too proud. It was a delicate balance to strike. A woman had to show her abilities, but she couldn't appear to be flaunting them. She had to be composed, her performance a mere extension of her decorum and modesty, never hinting at any kind of ambition or desire for attention. The process of courtship was thus not a spontaneous affair, but one marked by a rigid structure, carefully considered gestures, and, above all, social supervision. Every interaction was laden with the pressure of maintaining appearances. Even the smallest act could signal something improper. For women, the entire process was a test of patience, propriety, and restraint. For men, it was a matter of showing genuine interest, proving one's worth, and ensuring that nothing was done in haste or without proper approval. The importance of family in Victorian courtship cannot be overstated. A marriage was seen not only as a union between two individuals, but as a partnership between two families. This was why permission from the family was necessary before a proposal could be made. Women, particularly those of higher social standing, had little agency when it came to choosing their partners. Their families, typically their fathers or guardians, had the final say. The family was not only a protective force, but also a financial and social one. A woman's marriage could elevate her family status or keep it secure, while a poor match could lead to ruin. Even once the proposal was accepted, the process didn't end there. There was still a period of engagement, during which both families would finalize the terms of the marriage, considering not only the emotional aspects but the financial and social ones as well. The engagement was a formal arrangement, with the couple's interactions closely monitored. Even during this time, there were rules to follow: formal visits, proper conduct, and a careful management of emotions. The couple had to demonstrate their suitability to one another, but they were not yet allowed to fully engage in any emotional or physical intimacy. Ultimately, Victorian courtship was a deeply formal and highly structured process, governed by the expectations of family, society, and social norms. It was not merely about finding a romantic partner, but about ensuring that the match was one that would enhance the status of both families involved. Love, while important, was just one piece of the puzzle. Courtship, in the Victorian era, was a process of mutual respect, financial consideration, and social approval, where every move had to be measured and every action had to be weighed in terms of its potential impact on reputation and standing. To court someone was not simply to pursue a romantic interest. It was to engage in a long, drawn-out ritual that was as much about status and propriety as it was about love. In the world of Victorian society, nothing was more sacred or intricately choreographed than the formal dinner party. These gatherings, often hosted by the upper echelons of society, were far more than mere social events. They were public demonstrations of wealth, power, and, most importantly, adherence to the rigid social codes that defined the period. Each detail of the dinner, from the seating arrangements to the behavior of the guests, reflected the strict hierarchy and gender norms that were the backbone of Victorian life. When one attended a Victorian dinner party, it was not simply about enjoying a meal with friends or family. It was a carefully curated social performance where the most subtle actions could either elevate one's status or signal a lapse in decorum. Social hierarchy played a pivotal role in these gatherings, with guest seating arrangements reflecting their rank in society. The highest-ranking guests, such as important political figures or wealthy aristocrats, sat at the head of the table, while the others were placed according to their social status, with the lowest-ranking individuals seated further away from the hosts. These seating arrangements were never arbitrary. They were meticulously planned and calculated to reinforce the power dynamics of the time. The separation of men and women during these dinners was one of the most striking features of Victorian dining etiquette. As was customary in Victorian society, gender roles were sharply defined, and dinner parties were no exception. The men and women were not only separated physically but also segregated in their activities and conversations. While the men remained at the dining table, often engaging in animated discussions about business, politics, or philosophy, the women were expected to retire to the drawing rooms after the meal. This division was more than just a social practice. It was a reflection of the deeply ingrained belief that men and women had different spheres of influence and behavior. The men, now free from the constraints of decorum expected of women, would smoke cigars and sip port, their discussions often filled with more animated energy. Meanwhile, the women were expected to retire, engage in quieter conversation, and maintain a sense of grace and modesty. The behavior of the guests at these dinner parties was also governed by strict codes of conduct. The meal itself, though perhaps bountiful in comparison to the daily rations of the lower classes, was still modest in its presentation. The food, although often prepared with the best ingredients and culinary techniques available at the time, adhered to the restrained tastes of the Victorian era. Meals were not overly extravagant in terms of quantity or presentation, as that would have been seen as vulgar or wasteful. Instead, they focused on refined, simple courses, each served with utmost decorum. Entertainment during these formal dinners, too, followed an orderly and controlled format. Often, the main form of entertainment was musical performance. A pianist, a violinist, or perhaps a small ensemble would provide the evening's entertainment. However, these performances were not meant to evoke deep emotions or excitement. They were designed to maintain an atmosphere of refinement and sophistication, where any display of emotion or enthusiasm was suppressed in favor of genteel poise. The music served as a backdrop to the evening's conversation and reinforced the atmosphere of control and restraint that defined the dinner. The guests, for their part, were expected to participate in these performances in ways that adhered to the expectations of the time. The emotions they displayed, if any, had to be in line with the expectations of Victorian decorum. Laughter, for example, was permissible, but it had to be subdued and never loud or brash. Similarly, expressions of awe or admiration were allowed, but had to be conveyed in a restrained manner. To do otherwise would risk drawing attention to oneself and disrupting the carefully curated atmosphere of the event. Another key aspect of these gatherings was the ritualistic nature of the social interactions. Every conversation, every exchange of words had its place. The conversations during the dinner, while often formal, were usually characterized by small talk about topics that were safe and socially acceptable, art, music, and literature being the most common subjects. Discussions of politics or personal opinions were reserved for more private settings, as open debate or controversial topics could cause offense or stir social unease. At a Victorian dinner party, maintaining the appearance of civility and decorum was of the utmost importance, and any deviation from these expectations could lead to a lasting stain on one's reputation. As the evening progressed, the women's departure to the drawing rooms was a clear marker of the gendered division that governed not only the dinner but Victorian society itself. This transition, though seemingly casual, was another example of how deeply entrenched gender roles were in every aspect of life. The women were left behind to engage in activities that were considered more suited to their nature, such as conversation, music, and embroidery, while the men continued their discussions, often delving into topics that were outside the realm of women's perceived capabilities. These divisions were not accidental. They were systematic and intentional, designed to reinforce the boundaries between the public and private spheres, between male and female domains. At these formal dinners, where every moment was dictated by etiquette, propriety, and social order, the dinner itself was not just a meal, but a symbol of social standing and power. The wealth and status of the hosts were on full display, and guests were keenly aware of their role within the hierarchy. Their behavior was scrutinized, their words weighed, and their movements measured in accordance with the strict codes that governed Victorian social life. The dinner party was an essential part of social life for the wealthy and the noble, a time when one's position in society could be affirmed or threatened by a single misstep. To navigate the complexities of these gatherings was a skill in itself, one that required an understanding of not only social expectations, but also the subtle dynamics that governed the relationships between individuals. The Victorian dinner party was a microcosm of the larger social structure that permeated every facet of life in the era. It was a reflection of the rigidity and formality that defined Victorian society, where every action had its place and every conversation its boundaries. Through the act of eating, conversing, and entertaining, the participants in these dinners reinforced the power dynamics, gender roles, and class distinctions that underpinned the very fabric of the time. The formal dinner, with its strict codes and expectations, was more than just an evening of food and drink. It was a performance, a demonstration of one's place in the world. In the intricate and often oppressive web of Victorian society, social rivalry was a constant and subtle force, especially among young women. The stakes were high, and the rewards of securing a desirable marriage could elevate one's social status, offering security, wealth, and the promise of a better life. But the path to this success was narrow and fraught with pressure, as every gesture, every choice in dress, and every conversation was scrutinized. Competition was not only a matter of personal ambition, but a societal necessity, one that demanded adherence to a set of unwritten rules that governed a woman's behavior, appearance, and interactions. From the moment young women entered the social scene, they were acutely aware of the unspoken competition around them. Every aspect of their public life became part of this unyielding contest for status. Their clothes, while elaborate, were not merely a display of wealth but a statement of propriety. A woman's dress had to be just right, elegant but not too ostentatious, fashionable but not overdone. An excess of frills, a garish color, or a poorly timed trend could make one the subject of scorn. It wasn't just the material wealth that mattered. It was the ability to convey one's refinement and adherence to the societal expectations of the day. How a woman dressed spoke volumes about her family's standing and her personal worth in the marriage market. The way a young woman carried herself also played a critical role in this subtle rivalry. Grace, poise, and a certain controlled demeanor were the hallmark of an accomplished lady. She was expected to maintain a quiet confidence that spoke of her upbringing and self-discipline. Too much confidence, however, could be mistaken for arrogance, while too little could suggest insecurity or, worse, a lack of charm. These nuances were not lost on anyone who mattered. The way a woman spoke, her tone, her choice of words, her ability to engage in conversations without seeming too eager or too distant, was a measure of her social grace. One wrong move, one poorly chosen word, and she risked being cast aside in favor of someone more composed, someone better suited to the ideal image of a Victorian woman. Perhaps the most devastating consequence of this constant rivalry was the way a woman's reputation could be destroyed by a single indiscretion. In an era where appearances were paramount, a single misstep could send ripples through a family's social fabric. An unchaperoned walk, a fleeting interaction with a man, or a moment of too much emotion could result in scandal. Once a woman's reputation was tarnished, it was nearly impossible to regain the respect of her peers. A reputation for modesty, restraint, and propriety was essential for a young woman in Victorian society, as it was the foundation upon which her future marriage prospects rested. A scandal could not only ruin her chances for a good match, but also leave her family disgraced and shunned. This was not a mere possibility. It was a harsh reality that shaped every action, every decision made by the women of this era. In addition to the heavy burden placed on young women, this intense rivalry also extended to their families. A woman's reputation was a reflection of her upbringing, her parents' social standing, and their ability to maintain control over their household. Families who failed to keep their daughters in check risked losing their place in society, and this could have devastating consequences. For the Victorian upper and middle classes, a fall from grace was not simply a personal embarrassment, it was a social catastrophe. A family could find itself ostracized, its financial and social ties severed. Even in the most discreet circles, the whispers of scandal would travel far and fast. For the Victorians, reputation was everything, and a lapse in decorum was enough to send one spiraling into ruin. In contrast to the competitive nature of women, men in the Victorian era had a different set of expectations to meet, but their behavior was also heavily scrutinized. While men did not face the same level of judgment when it came to physical appearance and decorum, their worth was measured in terms of their social and professional achievements. For young men, competition often took the form of proving one's ability to provide, to be successful in business, and to manage a household. Yet, while men's positions were more flexible, they still faced the pressure of upholding family honor through wealth, status, and marriage. They could not afford to be seen with a woman of questionable reputation, for it would reflect poorly on their ability to choose a suitable wife, and thus jeopardize their own status. Thus, in this highly competitive environment, where every action, word, and appearance were scrutinized, the pressure was immense. For young women, the stakes were particularly high. Beyond the competition to find a suitor, there was also the relentless challenge of maintaining one's dignity and reputation in a society that was unforgiving to those who failed to comply with its norms. The unspoken rivalry could create an atmosphere of constant anxiety and stress, where women were not just battling for marriage proposals but for the very right to be seen as worthy of respect. For all its strictness, however, this competition also played a key role in defining the social fabric of Victorian society. It ensured that a woman's role was well defined, her behavior controlled, and her actions measured. It also provided a framework for social order, with the rules of competition ensuring that only those who conformed to the strict codes of conduct would succeed. At the same time, this created a system of social exclusion, where those who deviated from the norm were punished often by ostracism and scandal. In the face of such fierce competition, some women found ways to succeed by playing the game, mastering the delicate balance between propriety and charisma, restraint and confidence. For others, the pressure was too much to bear. Their reputations, once sullied, would never be the same. And in a society so heavily defined by reputation, a single mistake could undo a lifetime of careful social positioning. This invisible battle, this quiet war of social maneuvering, was not only confined to the women of the Victorian era, it permeated every corner of life: social gatherings, family interactions, public appearances, and even private moments of introspection. Women constantly had to navigate a world where their worth was determined by their ability to adhere to an unspoken set of rules. It was a competition that, in many ways, was impossible to win, yet one that every woman had to participate in to secure her place in society. The constant, subtle rivalry shaped everything. The way women walked, talked, dressed, and behaved all had an unspoken significance. It was a system that valued appearance over substance, where a woman's worth was often judged by the smallest details: the color of her dress, the lilt of her voice, the way she carried herself. It was a cruel system, yet one that defined the very fabric of Victorian society. And for all the modern conveniences and freedoms we enjoy today, the echoes of this era of the rivalry, the competition, the pressure to conform still linger, reminding us of the ways in which we continue to judge each other by the most superficial of standards. In the highly structured and reserved society of the Victorian era, the exchange of gifts was not merely an act of affection, but a significant, formal part of the courtship process. While today we may associate gifts with spontaneous gestures of love or simple appreciation, in Victorian times, a gift could carry far more weight. It was a serious declaration of intent, a promise of future commitment, and an unspoken communication between families. The practice of giving gifts before engagements was rooted in social and cultural traditions that emphasized formality, propriety, and, above all, the importance of reputation and social standing. Gift giving in this context was imbued with significance, often serving as a marker of a gentleman's serious interest in a lady, signaling not only affection but a future proposal. Poetry books, beautifully bound and carefully selected, were common gifts during courtship. They were not just tokens of sentiment, but symbols of a man's intentions. A well-chosen verse could convey admiration, express devotion, or even subtly hint at future plans. Letters, too, held immense value. Written words were highly prized, especially in an era when communication was slower and more deliberate. A letter exchange between a young man and a young woman was carefully penned, often containing layers of meaning, emotional restraint, and cultural allusions. These tokens, while seemingly small, held the potential to shape the trajectory of a relationship. A single, poorly phrased letter could alter a young woman's perception of a suitor, or worse, send him to the social periphery if he failed to meet the stringent expectations. In this rigidly formal society, relationships were not simply about personal affection, but about carefully managing social ties, securing alliances, and ensuring the preservation of status. As such, the exchange of gifts was often seen as a public declaration of seriousness. These exchanges were carefully timed and executed to maintain decorum. It was a ritual that demonstrated the suitor's willingness to engage with the lady's family and make a public commitment to their future, under the watchful eyes of society. The gifts themselves were not frivolous. They were deeply meaningful. Even the simplest items, such as a small piece of cloth or a coin, carried profound significance. These objects were not just tokens of affection, but representations of the boundaries, expectations, and roles that governed relationships. Moreover, the role of servants in these exchanges cannot be underestimated. In an era when privacy was a luxury few could afford, servants often acted as intermediaries, delivering these gifts or messages between suitors and their intendeds. They were integral to the social machinery, playing a part in the process of courtship that was both hidden and essential. The significance of these exchanges, mediated by servants, was not just in the gifts themselves, but in the discreet manner in which they were passed. Servants were not just carriers of goods, they were also participants in the complex dance of social relationships. They witnessed the private gestures of affection, the carefully written notes, and the subtle signals exchanged between families. This added another layer of intrigue and secrecy to the already reserved nature of Victorian courtship, as these exchanges were often carried out behind closed doors, far from the public eye. The modesty of these gifts, like a coin or a knife, was symbolic of the reserved nature of Victorian relationships. A coin, especially one given during the early stages of a courtship, could be viewed as a promise, an offering that carried with it the weight of the suitor's intentions. A knife, perhaps as part of a collection or a singular gift, symbolized the practicality of relationships during this time. Unlike today's gifts, which often signify love or affection in a personal and emotional sense, Victorian gifts served a dual purpose. They were both a manifestation of affection and an assertion of social respect. Their meaning was not merely sentimental, but deeply intertwined with the intricacies of status, family approval, and the need to demonstrate one's worth in a highly structured society. The exchange of these gifts was also a performance, a carefully crafted ritual that could influence public opinion. A gift's value did not just lie in its cost, but in its capacity to reflect the giver's status, intentions, and cultural awareness. For the young man courting a lady, the act of choosing and presenting a gift was an opportunity to demonstrate his affluence, taste, and understanding of the social codes that governed relationships. For the lady, receiving such a gift was a measure of her worth, and how she responded, whether with a show of gratitude, restraint, or enthusiasm, was equally scrutinized. Every word, every glance, every movement carried meaning, and no part of the courtship process was left to chance. This intricate, formal system of gift-giving was designed to maintain the status quo, ensuring that relationships were carefully regulated and controlled. The act of giving a gift, whether it was a book, a poem, or a simple coin, was not simply an act of personal affection. It was a signal, a message, and a part of the larger social dance that governed courtship and marriage. These gifts were the foundation upon which families built alliances, secured social standing, and ensured that their children married within the appropriate circles. In this context, even the smallest gift became an important symbol of commitment and intent, something that could define a young woman's future and, by extension, the reputation and future of her entire family. Courtship in the Victorian era was not just about personal preference or romantic love. It was a social contract, one in which both parties were aware of the implications their actions had on their family's reputation and social standing. The act of giving a gift, therefore, transcended personal sentiment. It was a formal, public declaration of intent and seriousness. Gifts were tokens of respect, symbols of honor, and pledges of loyalty carefully measured and thoroughly scrutinized. Whether it was a book, a letter, or a simple piece of cloth. Each gift carried its own weight, both literal and metaphorical, in the world of Victorian courtship. These exchanges, while seemingly simple, reveal a complex web of social expectations, familial responsibilities, and cultural practices that defined relationships during the Victorian era. The small, intimate acts of gift-giving passed from hand to hand, delivered by servants, and carefully measured for their appropriateness were, in their way, as significant as the grand gestures that are often associated with romantic courtship today. Yet, behind every gift, every letter, and every subtle exchange lay a world governed by tradition, restraint, and the ever-present need to conform to the expectations of a society that valued propriety above all else. Courtship in Victorian society was a deeply formalized process, governed by strict social conventions, family expectations, and the rigid class structures of the time. Unlike today, where romantic relationships may flourish organically, with the freedom to explore personal emotions and desires, Victorian courtship was a performance, a highly regulated and often complicated affair. Every interaction, every glance, every conversation was scrutinized by family and society, ensuring that no part of the courtship process strayed from the prescribed norms. Love was still a component, but it was tempered with a heavy dose of practicality, social expectations, and, often, financial considerations. The very progression of courtship began with a formal request for permission. Unlike modern dating, where individuals freely meet and choose one another, the Victorian system required that any intentions be made clear through official channels, typically involving the woman's family. This system ensured that both families were involved from the outset, thereby maintaining control over the relationship. It was not enough for a man simply to express an interest in a woman. He needed to formally seek permission from her parents to court her. This request marked the beginning of what would be a carefully choreographed relationship. The couple's affections were secondary to the agreement and approval of their respective families, whose primary concern was ensuring that any union made social and economic sense. This formal request was not simply a mere politeness or a gesture of respect. It was a critical step in cementing the future of the relationship. A man could not, under any circumstances, proceed with courting a woman unless the woman's family had granted their consent. Once permission was granted, the couple could move forward with their interactions. But those interactions would still be carefully monitored and structured. The strict social rules surrounding courtship ensured that every action and behavior conformed to the standards expected of people in their social classes. The idea of romantic love as the guiding principle of courtship was secondary to maintaining one's social standing, family, honor, and reputation. The interaction between the young couple was always conducted in public, or at least with the awareness of family members. Public displays of affection, what we might consider to be normal today, were strictly prohibited in the Victorian era. There would be no passionate exchanges, no hurried kisses, no romantic gestures that might be considered improper. Any physical affection was reserved for private moments, often under the supervision of a chaperone. Even the briefest touch or the slightest display of intimacy could cause scandal and irreparable harm to a woman's reputation. As a result, courtship was conducted with remarkable restraint, both for the sake of propriety and in order to avoid the social consequences of any misstep. This level of supervision extended to every aspect of the relationship. Young women were typically chaperoned by a family member, often a maid or an older relative, to ensure that no unapproved contact could occur. Their every move and action were carefully watched to ensure compliance with social norms. Courtship interactions were typically in the form of visits, often at the woman's home, where the couple would engage in polite conversation, enjoy musical performances, or partake in other activities appropriate for their social standing. But even these interactions had to follow strict rules. Conversations were limited to safe topics, religion, art, literature, and moral behavior, while personal discussions or expressions of deeper emotions were discouraged. The idea was to keep emotions in check and avoid any situations where either party could display behavior deemed inappropriate. While the courtship was often seen as a ritual of growing affection, it was just as much an economic and social contract as a romantic endeavor. This was particularly true in the case of the upper classes. For them, a marriage was not simply the union of two individuals, but the consolidation of power, wealth, and status. The wedding could cement alliances, secure land or property, and increase one's influence. It was a decision that went beyond love and romance and included factors such as lineage, wealth, and family reputation. The couple's union often involved intricate negotiations between families, where matters like dowries, inheritance rights, and social connections took precedence. The match was made not just between two people, but between two families, whose reputations and social standing would be forever entwined. Engagements, when they did occur, were considered serious commitments. They were seen as social contracts, with legally binding consequences, both for the couple and their families. After the formal permission to court, if the relationship continued to progress, it would lead to the formal engagement. An engagement was not a casual affair, but a serious promise between families. The engagement period allowed for a formal announcement of the union and was followed by extensive preparations for the wedding. The couple's social standing, wealth, and family connections were integral to the success of the union. Every step of the process, from the engagement announcement to the wedding, was steeped in tradition and ceremony. The engagement itself was often viewed as more of a contractual agreement than an emotional commitment. Unlike today's romantic engagements, where emotions run high and personal preferences are the driving forces, the Victorian engagement was often a matter of social and economic calculation. It was a formal announcement of a future union that reflected the family's expectations and desires rather than the couple's individual emotional connection. The engagement was less about love and more about ensuring the preservation of family standing, social respect, and wealth. Any disruption to this carefully laid plan, whether by a broken engagement or a marriage that failed to meet societal expectations, was viewed with great dishonor. What this reveals is that courtship in the Victorian era was far more about societal function than personal desire. The couple's emotions, while not irrelevant, were secondary to the formalities and traditions that dictated how they could interact, when they could interact, and even how they could express affection. Love and romance were in many ways confined to the private, personal realms of the heart. But when it came to public life, appearances and propriety ruled. Even a slight deviation from these prescribed behaviors could result in public humiliation, social exclusion, and the loss of family reputation. At the heart of Victorian courtship was a carefully structured process that made clear the stakes for both parties. Marriage was a serious social contract, one that had profound implications not only for the individuals involved, but for the families who stood behind them. This institution, for all its rigid protocols and complex traditions, was designed to ensure that both parties would enter into a union with a clear understanding of their social responsibilities, obligations, and roles. In the end, while individual emotions played a part, the institution of courtship was far more concerned with the preservation of social order than with personal desires or romantic aspirations. The preparations for a Victorian wedding were far from a simple affair. Weddings in this era were not only monumental in terms of personal commitment, but also complex social events that required meticulous planning and adherence to tradition. Each step of the process, from the engagement to the wedding day, was governed by a strict set of rules and expectations. For the bride, this meant the creation of a significant wardrobe, one that not only symbolized her new role as a wife but also represented her family's social standing. A key element in wedding preparations was the trousseau, often referred to as the hope chest, a deeply symbolic part of Victorian bridal customs. The trousseau was a collection of clothing, linens, and personal items the bride would need for married life. It was a practical collection of essentials, but also a statement of wealth, class, and familial preparation. Brides spent months, sometimes years, carefully assembling the contents of the trousseau. This might include multiple dresses for different occasions, each one chosen with great care to reflect the appropriate level of formality and respectability. Each piece of clothing in the trousseau, from everyday wear to formal evening gowns, had to adhere to the established social norms. The bride's wardrobe was essentially a reflection of her readiness to transition into her new role as a married woman, and was a symbol of her family's ability to meet the expectations of high society. In addition to the trousseau, the preparations included the selection of outfits for the wedding itself. Victorian weddings were highly formal, and every aspect of the ceremony was dictated by strict codes of behavior and dress. The bride was expected to wear the most elegant and dignified gown available, typically white or ivory, signifying purity and the solemnity of the occasion. This dress was not just a choice of fashion, but a statement of her readiness for marriage and the new responsibilities she would undertake. The groom, too, had to dress in a manner befitting the occasion. His attire, while perhaps not as elaborate as the bride's, had to be equally formal and respectful of the societal expectations of the time. The ceremony itself was a traditional, carefully orchestrated event, laden with symbolic gestures and rituals. Victorian weddings were highly structured, with every detail of the ceremony down to the time of the service, the music, and the seating arrangements carefully planned. The couple's behavior during the ceremony was also regulated. The bride was expected to remain demure and composed, showing reverence and restraint throughout the service. She was expected to follow the prescribed rituals without deviation, ensuring her role as a symbol of virtue and decorum. The groom, similarly, had to act with dignity and adhere to the expected roles, performing the ritualized actions that marked the beginning of his new life as a married man. The transition into marriage was not just a personal change for the couple, but a social one as well. Marriage in the Victorian era was viewed as a serious contract, both a personal commitment and a social obligation. The wife's role was clearly defined. She was expected to manage the household, supervise the servants, and support her husband's social life. This responsibility was not merely domestic in nature, but also carried significant social weight. The wife's ability to maintain a well-ordered home was seen as a reflection of the family status. The home had to be managed with efficiency and grace, as any signs of disorder or lack of control could tarnish the reputation of the family. The wife's role extended beyond the walls of the home. In the social spheres of the Victorian elite, a woman's behavior was scrutinized in every aspect of her life. Her actions at social gatherings, dinners, and public events were under constant observation. She was expected to support her husband in his social and professional dealings, which often meant entertaining guests, attending events, and ensuring that the couple's social calendar was well managed. Her reputation was intimately tied to her husband's, and thus she was expected to contribute to maintaining their standing in society through her behavior, her appearance, and her ability to manage social interactions with grace. While the expectations placed on the wife were significant, the husband's role was equally important in maintaining the family's status. He was the head of the household, the primary breadwinner, and the individual responsible for managing the family's finances and public image. Victorian marriages were often based on the idea of complementing each other's roles, with the husband assuming the role of provider and protector, and the wife ensuring the domestic sphere was managed efficiently. These roles were not just defined by family dynamics, but by society's strict rules for how men and women should behave in marriage. This partnership, while outwardly harmonious, was also a reflection of the strict social class system that governed Victorian society. The marriage contract was not solely about personal affection or romantic love. Instead, it was a strategic alliance designed to preserve the family's position in the social hierarchy. The idea of marriage as a social contract was pervasive, and marriages were often arranged or heavily influenced by families to ensure the continuation of wealth, status, and property. The expectation that marriage would bring with it clearly defined roles for both partners was reinforced throughout the wedding preparations. The bride's trousseau, the couple's behavior during the ceremony, and the subsequent transition into marriage were all aligned with the notion that the institution of marriage was not just a personal commitment, but a crucial component of social order. For the wife, especially, marriage was a role defined by societal expectations, and the way she managed the household and her relationship with her husband could either elevate or diminish the family's status in society. Weddings in the Victorian era, then, were more than just celebrations of love. They were solemn occasions that reinforced the deeply ingrained class structures and social expectations of the time. The lavish preparations, the adherence to formality, and the clear delineation of roles all contributed to the creation of a society where marriages were both personal and public, private and political. For the bride and groom, this meant navigating a complex set of expectations, each with its own weight and consequence. The traditional, dignified nature of the ceremony reflected the seriousness with which marriage was regarded. The transition into married life was viewed as a significant milestone, not only in terms of personal growth but also in terms of social positioning. Marriage in Victorian England was thus both an intensely personal journey and a deeply social contract, guided by a system of rules that shaped every aspect of the couple's life. From the wedding preparations to the establishment of their roles within the household, every aspect of Victorian marriage was framed within the context of social expectations. These roles, though restrictive, were an integral part of the Victorian worldview, ensuring that society maintained order and stability even in the most intimate and personal spheres of life. After the wedding, the dynamics of marriage for the Victorian aristocracy extended far beyond the immediate union of two individuals. It was a complex system of alliances, responsibilities, and obligations that went beyond personal affection. Marriages in Victorian society were not merely about love, but about securing social positions, maintaining family legacies, and managing wealth. For the aristocracy, this was particularly evident in the practice of maintaining dual residences, one in the city and one in the countryside. These dual residences were a sign of status, symbolizing both wealth and the ability to maintain the social structure that was so deeply ingrained in Victorian life. A grand townhouse was expected in a fashionable district of London, while a large estate or manor in the countryside served as a retreat from the social demands of the city. These homes were not just places of residence, they were symbolic of the family's place within the hierarchy. A family's ability to maintain such estates was proof of their wealth, influence, and above all, their success in navigating the intricacies of Victorian society. The division between the town and country was not merely geographical, it represented a division of responsibilities and roles. The country estate often served as the center of family life, where the wife would manage the household, organize local charity events, and maintain her role as the lady of the manor. It was in these serene surroundings that women were expected to carry out their domestic duties, manage servants, and play host to social gatherings. However, it was also within the walls of the grand town house that the true power dynamics of the aristocracy played out. In the city, the focus shifted to public life and the social circuit. High society events, such as balls, dinners, and private gatherings, dictated much of the aristocracy's activities. The husband's role in this environment was to build and maintain his social alliances, while the wife's role was to ensure that her presence and conduct were above reproach. Both had to navigate this world with care, as a single misstep in either sphere could result in social disgrace. The dual residence system, therefore, required a delicate balancing act between these two worlds, each with its own set of expectations and responsibilities. Marriage, for many Victorians, was not just a personal commitment but a strategic alliance. The union of two people often meant the merging of family estates, the intertwining of business interests, and the pooling of wealth. Financial settlements were an essential part of the marriage contract. These arrangements were made well in advance and were often deeply formalized, with legal documents that ensured the financial security of both parties, especially the wife. The concept of marriage settlements was so ingrained in Victorian society that it was considered almost as important as the vows exchanged during the ceremony itself. The merging of family assets was a primary consideration for many Victorian couples, especially for those in the upper classes. The wealth and land brought by each partner could determine the stability of the union and the future prospects of their children. It was not uncommon for marriages to be negotiated with the same level of business acumen one might use to broker a deal. The families involved had to ensure that their social standing was protected and enhanced through the marriage. For the aristocracy, these marriages often meant the consolidation of power, wealth, and influence. Despite the rigid social structures and expectations, many Victorian couples did find personal happiness within the boundaries set by their society. The roles assigned to each partner, though restrictive, were designed to maintain a sense of order and propriety, which many people came to accept as part of their daily lives. In these circumstances, it became possible for some couples to form genuine affection and build strong, enduring relationships. Love in Victorian marriages, while often subdued and constrained by societal expectations, could still flourish, albeit within the confines of the roles society demanded. The wife, for instance, might find fulfillment in managing her household and ensuring the smooth operation of the family estate. She might take pride in overseeing the running of the manor, ensuring that her home was a haven of order and respectability. Her role, though demanding, often provided her with a sense of purpose, as she played a pivotal part in maintaining the family's reputation and standing. For many women, the responsibilities of marriage allowed them to find satisfaction in their ability to navigate the complex world of Victorian society. Likewise, the husband's role in maintaining the family's social standing and wealth also provided him with a sense of purpose. He was expected to manage the family's business dealings, represent them at social functions, and ensure that the family's interests were protected in both the public and private spheres. Many men found a sense of pride in fulfilling these duties, seeing themselves as the protectors of their family's legacy. Though marriage in the Victorian era was not without its challenges and constraints, it provided many couples with a clear structure within which they could thrive. The boundaries of their roles, though limiting in many respects, offered a sense of stability and order that was deeply valued by those who lived within these rigid expectations. Within the confines of these roles, Victorian couples were often able to find happiness, build strong relationships, and fulfill their responsibilities to both their families and society. For the aristocracy, marriage was often a carefully crafted performance, where both partners played their parts according to a script that had been handed down through generations. While personal affection might have been secondary to the social and financial considerations that defined these unions, there was still room for the quiet joys of companionship and shared purpose. These marriages, based as they were on duty, social standing, and wealth, allowed couples to navigate the complex terrain of Victorian society and to fulfill the roles assigned to them by tradition and law. As time went on, the expectations placed upon Victorian couples evolved, but the underlying principles of marriage remained the same. The role of the wife as the custodian of the home and the family's reputation, and the role of the husband as the provider and protector, continued to define the nature of Victorian unions. The marriage contract, both personal and social, remained a cornerstone of Victorian society, ensuring the continuity of family lines, the preservation of wealth, and the maintenance of social order. Even in the face of personal challenges, many couples found ways to make their marriages work within the strict framework that society had set for them. In the end, marriage in the Victorian era was not just about the union of two people. It was about maintaining a delicate balance between personal desires and societal expectations. It was about navigating a world in which social status, family reputation, and financial stability were intertwined with love and affection. For many Victorian couples, the weight of these expectations might have been heavy, but it also allowed them to build lives of stability, purpose, and sometimes happiness. In Victorian society, the structure of the family was rigid and firmly defined by gender roles. At the head of the household stood the patriarch, the father, who held absolute authority over the family's affairs. His word was law, and his decisions impacted the daily life and direction of the entire family. As the breadwinner and the family's protector, his role was one of leadership, and it was expected that he would fulfill this role with unwavering authority. The father's dominance, however, was balanced by the matriarch, the mother, whose primary responsibility was to manage the home and raise the children. The mother's domain was the household, where she ensured that everything from the household chores to the emotional health of the family was taken care of. Despite being the heart of the home, she had limited agency outside of her domestic sphere, and her actions were governed by the patriarch's authority. The Victorian era placed an enormous emphasis on the distinction between the public and private spheres. And for women, their primary place was in the home, where they were expected to instill the virtues of Victorian society in their children. Raising children was seen as an art form in Victorian families, with a strict code of conduct that shaped every aspect of a child's upbringing. Victorian parents, especially those from the upper classes, adhered to a strict moral code that emphasized obedience, duty, and respect. Childhood was not seen as a time for frivolity or emotional indulgence. Instead, children were expected to adhere to a set of rules that taught them the importance of self-discipline, responsibility, and the avoidance of any behavior that might bring shame or dishonor to the family name. The treatment of children in the Victorian era was influenced heavily by the idea of character formation, a concept central to child rearing at the time. To build character, children were expected to learn the values of hard work, morality, and obedience through discipline and strict boundaries. These children were not coddled or encouraged to express their emotions freely. Instead, they were taught to suppress their desires and to focus on the needs of society and family. Displays of emotion, particularly those that involved weakness or vulnerability, were discouraged. Instead, the Victorian ideal emphasized self-control and the ability to maintain composure in any situation. Victorian parenting was also deeply tied to the notion of class and social standing. Parents, particularly from the aristocracy and the rising middle class, ensured that their children were educated in the ways of the elite. This included not only academic education but also social and cultural instruction. Children were trained to understand the customs, behaviors, and manners expected of them in the world of high society. They were taught to be well-behaved, articulate, and poised, skills that would serve them well in later years when they would be expected to take up positions of responsibility within their class. The strictness of Victorian parenting often meant that children were expected to remain emotionally distant from their parents. While affection was not completely absent, it was often tempered with formality. Parents did not indulge in overt displays of love or emotional warmth. Instead, children were expected to be grateful for the opportunities they were given and to appreciate their place in the social order. A child's primary purpose, especially in wealthier families, was to continue the legacy of the family name and ensure the social standing of the parents. Therefore, affection was often subordinated to the importance of maintaining decorum and propriety. Discipline was central to Victorian parenting. Children were expected to follow instructions without question, and any form of disobedience was met with harsh punishment. Corporal punishment was common, especially among the lower and middle classes, and was seen as an effective way to correct behavior and ensure obedience. Even in wealthier households, where physical punishment might be less frequent, children still faced the constant pressure to behave according to the strict standards of their parents. In many ways, the home became a training ground for the larger, more rigidly structured society outside. In this environment, the role of the mother was often one of emotional restraint. As the primary caretaker, she was responsible for the emotional development of her children, yet she was expected to maintain a level of detachment. Her affection for her children was rarely expressed through physical touch or emotional support, but rather through the maintenance of order and propriety. For example, a mother's love was often expressed through the teaching of values, the establishment of rules, and the enforcement of boundaries that kept children in line with social expectations. The absence of personal expression in Victorian childhood was also reflected in the schooling system. Children were educated according to rigid standards that emphasized not just knowledge, but also discipline and obedience. Schools were places of strict authority, where physical punishment was not uncommon for infractions, such as talking out of turn or failing to meet academic expectations. This formalized approach to education was seen as necessary to prepare children for their roles in the adult world. It was a world where personal expression was stifled in favor of conformity and restraint. The sense of social responsibility placed on children was profound. They were brought up to understand their role in society and were expected to act as extensions of their family's honor and reputation. Children were trained not to question authority, but to uphold it, whether that authority came from their parents, teachers, or society at large. This created a sense of duty, but it also meant that children's own desires were often secondary to the needs of the family and the demands of society. The rigid gender roles that characterized Victorian society also had a significant impact on family dynamics. Boys and girls were raised differently, with distinct expectations for each gender. Boys were prepared for the responsibilities of adulthood, which often included running a household or managing family business affairs. Girls, on the other hand, were groomed for marriage and motherhood. Their education emphasized domestic skills, manners, and the importance of maintaining a proper home. There was little room for personal ambition or desires outside of the expected roles. The notion of gendered duty was deeply entrenched, and both boys and girls were expected to follow their designated paths without deviation. In this context, the role of the father as the primary authority figure took on added significance. He was the ultimate decision maker in the household, and his authority was absolute. Even as society began to change, with the rise of industrialization and the growing influence of women's rights movements, the Victorian family structure remained firmly rooted in patriarchal values. The father's word was law, and his role as the head of the family was never questioned. The influence of these rigid family dynamics extended far beyond the home. Victorian society was built on a foundation of strict class distinctions, and these distinctions were reinforced through the ways in which children were raised. From an early age, children were taught their place in the social order. They were taught not just to respect their elders, but to know their position within the larger social structure. Whether they were raised in a noble household or a working-class home, children understood that their actions were part of a much larger system that dictated their future. The family dynamic in Victorian society was one of rigid structure and formality, driven by the need to maintain social order and uphold reputations. While this system may have provided a sense of stability, it also stifled personal expression and emotional growth. Children were raised to conform to society's expectations, with little room for deviation. The influence of their parents, especially the father, was absolute, and their roles were clearly defined. This created a society where personal desires and emotional connections were secondary to duty, discipline, and the preservation of social standing. The legacy of these family dynamics continued to shape Victorian society long after the period ended. The role of women in Victorian society was firmly entrenched within the boundaries of domestic life, with society dictating that their primary purpose was to be wives, mothers, and caregivers. This role was not only expected, but was deeply woven into the fabric of Victorian norms. Women's place was seen as firmly within the home, where they were tasked with managing the household, raising children, and supporting their husbands. For many, marriage was the ultimate goal, and it was in this institution that they would find fulfillment, identity, and social recognition. However, despite these strict confines, Victorian women found subtle and often quiet ways to exert influence in areas outside the home, carving out roles for themselves that, though limited, had profound effects on society. The notion of womanhood in Victorian England was largely tied to ideals of purity, piety, and submission. A lady was expected to embody these virtues, and her behavior was meticulously curated to ensure that she conformed to society's standards of decency and grace. From an early age, girls were taught the virtues of modesty, gentleness, and domestic skills. These teachings were reinforced by the expectation that women would be dependent on their fathers before marriage and then upon their husbands. Once they were Wednesday, women, as a result, were granted limited access to education and the workforce, further reinforcing their role as homemakers. Education for girls was often limited to subjects that would prepare them for life in the home: reading, writing, drawing, and a basic understanding of household management. Higher education or professions were largely unavailable, as society considered them unnecessary for women. The belief was that a woman's role did not extend beyond managing domestic affairs or rearing children. Even when women showed intellectual curiosity, their educational pursuits were typically stifled, and they were redirected toward the more acceptable endeavors of knitting, music, or other domestic arts that contributed to the nurturing of the home. For girls born into wealthier families, a refined education was provided, but again, The emphasis was always on preparing them for marriage, not for independence or professional work. But even within these constraints, Victorian women carved out spaces where they could influence society. While they were largely restricted from entering professions, many women found their calling in the world of charity work and social activism. The Victorian period witnessed a growing number of women involved in charitable causes, especially in the fields of education, healthcare, and social reform. Women of the upper and middle classes had more opportunities to engage in these areas, often taking on roles that allowed them to lead and manage organizations focused on helping the poor or supporting women and children in need. One such notable movement was the rise of women's involvement in religious charities. Many women became active in local religious communities, offering their time and efforts to assist the underprivileged. The church played a significant role in encouraging this form of benevolence, offering women a socially acceptable outlet for their energies and an avenue for public service. Women's involvement in religious charity work was seen as an extension of their domestic role, yet it provided them with opportunities to gain influence, whether by fundraising, organizing services, or participating in outreach programs. Additionally, the Victorian era saw the emergence of early feminist movements, with women beginning to demand the right to vote and engage in public life. The suffrage movement, while in its early stages, gained momentum during the late 19th century, with women like Emmeline Pankhurst and Millicent Fawcett leading the charge. These women, and many others, rejected the limitations placed on them by society and sought the right to have a voice in the political process. The suffrage movement, though facing significant opposition, marked a pivotal turning point in the role of women in society. These women faced ridicule, imprisonment, and even violence in their pursuit of equality, yet their work laid the foundation for future generations to continue the fight for women's rights. Despite these strides, the majority of women in Victorian society remained constrained by the societal expectations of the time. Women were still largely expected to focus their energies on their homes and families. The societal structure relegated women to the private sphere, while men dominated the public realm. This dichotomy often meant that women were excluded from political, economic, and intellectual circles. The social pressure to conform to these norms was immense, and many women lived their lives within the confines of their roles, quietly influencing their homes and communities, but rarely stepping outside the boundaries set for them. The Victorian concept of womanhood was also inextricably linked to notions of respectability, a woman's virtue, and thus her social standing was determined largely by her adherence to societal norms. Her reputation was everything, and a woman who strayed from the prescribed expectations faced not only public shaming but also the potential ruin of her family's standing. For women, their personal actions were a reflection of their family's status, and their behavior was always subject to scrutiny. A single misstep could lead to social ostracism, and for women in the Victorian era, even the smallest hint of scandal could shatter their reputations for life. In many ways, the expectations placed on women in Victorian society were suffocating. They were expected to embody a perfect ideal of femininity, marked by grace, beauty, and a calm, nurturing disposition. Their success was measured by their ability to conform to these ideals and maintain the smooth functioning of the family. Any deviation from these expectations, whether in behavior or appearance, could be seen as a failure of duty and an indication of a lack of self-discipline. Despite the limitations, many women managed to carve out fulfilling lives within the strictures of Victorian society, finding ways to assert their influence in ways that were often subtle but nonetheless powerful. While the Victorian era was defined by limitations on women's rights and opportunities, it was also a time when the seeds of change were being sown. The rise of the suffrage movement, the growth of women's charitable involvement, and the increased engagement in political activism laid the groundwork for future advancements in women's rights. Women in the Victorian period had to navigate a complex and often stifling society, but their persistence, determination, and quiet acts of resistance were instrumental in challenging the social norms that confined them. Though the struggle for equality was far from over, the work of these early pioneers was crucial in reshaping the way women would be seen in the future. In the years that followed, women would continue to push for greater autonomy, access to education, and political rights. The struggle for women's equality that began in the Victorian era would eventually lead to significant changes in the 20th century, including the right to vote, access to higher education, and increased participation in the workforce. The women of the Victorian period, while operating within a society that sought to limit their freedoms, were essential in setting the stage for the progress that would follow. Their contributions, though often hidden behind the walls of the home or within the confines of their social roles, helped to lay the foundation for the liberation and empowerment of women in the years to come. The Victorian era, a time of strict social hierarchy and rigid codes of behavior, was governed by one central principle: reputation. A family's place in society, their worth, and their status were determined by how well they conducted themselves in public. It was not enough to simply be wealthy or powerful. The appearance of respectability, of class, of grace, was of utmost importance. This concept of reputation permeated every aspect of Victorian life, from the way one dressed to the manner in which one interacted with others in social settings. The pursuit of an impeccable image was not just a matter of personal vanity, it was an essential component of social survival. In a world where reputation was everything, one could not afford to make mistakes. A single slip-up, a lapse in decorum, or a misstep in behavior could have lasting consequences, not just for the individual but for their family as a whole. Social appearances were everything, and the idea of saving face was deeply ingrained in the Victorian psyche. The value placed on proper conduct, on propriety, was reflected in the formality and structure of daily life. Every public appearance, every encounter with others was a performance, a chance to demonstrate one's status, education, and character. Public behavior in the Victorian era was a finely tuned act where every action was carefully considered and controlled. The expectation was that one would conduct themselves with dignity, composure, and grace, regardless of the circumstances. Whether attending a dinner party or stepping into a church, the rules of conduct were the same. Maintain an air of refinement, never show weakness or emotion, and always adhere to the socially acceptable standards. At formal gatherings, guests were expected to maintain their poise, avoid discussing controversial topics, and focus on safe subjects, like church sermons or the weather. This focus on composure was not just a personal choice, it was a societal expectation, and any breach of these unwritten rules could lead to scandal. One of the primary places where public appearances were of particular importance was in the home of the aristocracy, where dinner parties and social gatherings were a regular occurrence. These events were not merely about enjoying a meal or socializing, they were about displaying wealth, taste, and most importantly, good breeding. Dinner parties were elaborate affairs, with highly structured seating arrangements that reflected the guest's social rank. The food, too, was a carefully curated expression of the host's status. Dishes were often rich and elaborate, showcasing the family's wealth and access to exotic ingredients. The way guests interacted with one another, the conversations they had, and even the way they sat at the table were all governed by strict rules of etiquette. For women, The pressure to maintain appearances was especially intense. In addition to the demands placed on them by their family, women were expected to embody the ideals of femininity, gentleness, grace, and modesty in both their behavior and their appearance. Every gesture, every word, was scrutinized by society, and women were often judged not only by their actions but also by their ability to conform to the visual standards of respectability. This pressure to maintain a flawless public image was compounded by the fact that women's social lives were often confined to the domestic sphere. Their primary interactions occurred within their households, at social gatherings, or at church, where the importance of maintaining decorum was paramount. The church, in particular, was a focal point of Victorian public life. It was not just a place of worship, it was a place where societal norms were reinforced, and public behavior was observed and judged. Attending church on Sundays was an important part of a family's weekly routine, and one's behavior there reflected their moral standing. This focus on public image was not limited to the wealthy elite. Even the lower classes were expected to maintain a respectable appearance, especially when participating in public activities such as church services or town meetings. As a result, the line between public and private life was often blurred in Victorian society. While much of life took place behind closed doors, the way one conducted themselves in public could have significant consequences for their social standing. For the upper classes, this meant adhering to the strict codes of behavior that governed their interactions with others. For the working class, it meant finding ways to navigate the expectations of respectability within the limited means and opportunities available to them. But for both, the pressure to conform to societal norms was immense, and the consequences of failing to do so could be devastating. Reputation, therefore, was not just an abstract concept in Victorian society, it was the very foundation upon which a person's life was built. From the clothes they wore to the way they walked, talked, and behaved, every action was measured and evaluated by others. Maintaining the appearance of respectability was not optional. It was a requirement for acceptance in society. Even those who had wealth and power were not exempt from this scrutiny, as social standing was determined not only by one's material possessions, but by one's ability to display those possessions with grace and propriety. At the heart of this obsession with reputation was the belief that a person's outward appearance was a reflection of their inner character. In a society where public behavior was meticulously regulated, the idea of virtue was closely tied to external displays of respectability. A person's conduct was considered a direct reflection of their moral worth, and their ability to conform to the rigid standards of Victorian society was seen as an indication of their moral character. This belief was reinforced by the prevailing social structures of the time, which placed a premium on appearances and order, and which saw deviation from these norms as a threat to the social fabric. In this climate, public events were more than just gatherings. They were opportunities for individuals to assert their social position and display their adherence to the expected standards of behavior. From dinner parties to balls, from church services to street encounters, every interaction was an opportunity to reaffirm one's status and demonstrate one's commitment to the values of Victorian society. The pressure to conform to these expectations was intense, and for many, it was a daily struggle to maintain the delicate balance between personal desires and societal demands. The role of reputation in Victorian society was not simply about appearances, it was about survival. A person's reputation determined their social network, their opportunities, and their place in the world. For the upper classes, reputation could be used to secure alliances, gain favor, and maintain power. For the lower classes, Reputation could mean the difference between a stable life and a life of poverty and struggle. In both cases, reputation was something that had to be carefully managed and maintained, for a single misstep could lead to ruin. In many ways, the social rules of the Victorian era served as a way to maintain order and control. By ensuring that individuals adhered to strict codes of conduct, society could create a sense of stability and predictability. But these rules also had a darker side, as they enforced conformity and stifled individuality. The pressure to uphold one's reputation was not just about avoiding scandal, it was about ensuring that the social order was upheld and that each person knew their place. Ultimately, the emphasis on reputation in Victorian society was both a reflection of the era's values and a tool for maintaining social control. It was a system that rewarded conformity and punished deviation, where the stakes of every public interaction were incredibly high. But in this strict, rule-bound society, there was also room for quiet resistance. People, particularly women, found ways to exert influence and make their voices heard, even within the confines of the social structures that sought to limit them. Despite the immense pressure to conform, individuals found small acts of rebellion, whether through charity work, artistic expression, or social activism that allowed them to assert their own identities, even in a world that sought to control every aspect of their lives. Reputation, as it was understood in Victorian society, was both a source of power and a prison. It dictated the way people behaved, the opportunities they had, and the way they were perceived by others. But it also shaped their sense of self and their relationship with the world around them. The obsession with maintaining a flawless public image may seem superficial from a modern perspective, but in the context of Victorian society, it was a matter of survival, a means of navigating a world that was as rigid as it was unforgiving. Victorian education, much like many other facets of society during the era, was heavily influenced by class and gender. For the upper classes, education was not merely about acquiring knowledge. It was an integral part of maintaining and elevating their status. The wealthy sent their children to exclusive private schools or tutors, ensuring that their children received the best possible education that money could buy. This was in stark contrast to the education available to the lower classes, which was often rudimentary at best and inaccessible for many. The disparity between the two systems of education reinforced the already deep social and economic divides that defined the structure of Victorian society. At the heart of this educational divide was the idea that knowledge was a privilege, not a right, and that it was meant to be passed down to those with the proper social standing. For the upper classes, the curriculum was designed to groom children for positions of power and influence in society. Boys were taught not only how to read and write, but also how to manage estates, run businesses, and understand complex financial matters. They were trained to become leaders, whether in government, business, or the military. This was not just an education in the intellectual sense, but a preparation for their role in a world that was defined by hierarchy and privilege. Private schools and tutors ensured that young men were steeped in the classical education of ancient languages, philosophy, and literature, with an emphasis on shaping them into well-rounded, cultured individuals capable of managing their family's wealth and influence. Meanwhile, the girls of the Victorian upper class were often educated in ways that reinforced their role within the domestic sphere. While they might have received some basic literacy training, the focus was far more on developing the skills necessary for running a household. Girls were taught to sew, play the piano, and manage a servant staff. The education of women was not about expanding their minds in the same way as their male counterparts. Rather, it was about preparing them for marriage and motherhood. the ultimate roles a Victorian woman was expected to fill. There was little room for intellectual growth beyond these confines. Education for women was not considered a tool for their personal development or for securing a career. It was a means of preparing them to be the perfect wife, mother, and hostess figures that could sustain and support their husbands' public and private lives. For the lower classes, education was a far less structured and accessible affair. Most poor children had little to no formal education, with the vast majority entering the workforce at a young age to help their families survive. The working-class children who did have access to schooling often attended overcrowded, underfunded schools with basic curriculums that did little to equip them for anything beyond manual labor or domestic work. Reading, writing, and arithmetic were often taught in the most basic sense, but any higher learning was practically unheard of for those who were born into poverty. This lack of education for the working class had far-reaching consequences. It perpetuated the cycle of poverty, as the poor were never afforded the opportunity to break free from the economic constraints that defined their lives. Without access to education, they were denied the skills necessary to move into higher-paying, more skilled professions. The system ensured that people stayed in their designated social class with little to no chance of upward mobility. For many, education was a privilege that they would never experience, locked into a life of hard labor and limited opportunities. The gender divide in education during the Victorian era was just as stark as the class divide. Men had the opportunity to be educated in a way that opened doors to power, wealth, and opportunity. Women, on the other hand, were expected to fulfill roles that were traditionally domestic and private, with their education focused primarily on making them good wives and mothers. Women's education rarely extended beyond subjects like needlework, music, and the management of the home. Higher education for women was almost non-existent, with universities and academic institutions being largely closed off to them, and those who did manage to get a higher education were often met with criticism and social isolation. In contrast, the working-class women who did gain access to education often learned how to read and write, but their education was designed with the sole purpose of making them better workers or housewives. The social order demanded that women fulfill these roles, and education was merely a tool to reinforce the idea that women's primary value was within the home. Victorian society was rigid, and education, like many other aspects of life, was designed to maintain this structure. By keeping the upper and lower classes in separate educational spheres, society ensured that the wealthy remained in power and that the poor stayed in their place. Education was seen not as a right, but as a tool for preserving the status quo, reinforcing the belief that knowledge was something to be carefully controlled and distributed only to those who could afford it. Yet, there were exceptions. Despite the constraints placed on women and the working class, some were able to break through these barriers, at least partially. The rise of social reform movements in the Victorian era led to the establishment of more schools for the poor, and gradually, the idea of universal education began to take hold. The efforts of women's rights activists, who fought for women's access to higher education and professional opportunities, began to chip away at the societal norms that had restricted them for so long. While these movements were often slow and faced fierce resistance, they laid the groundwork for future generations who would not be content with the limitations imposed by Victorian society. Even so, the legacy of Victorian education, with its emphasis on class and gender divisions, continued to shape the structure of British society for many years. The belief that education should be reserved for the wealthy and that women's education should be focused on domesticity left a lasting impact on future generations. It wasn't until the 20th century with the rise of progressive education and social reform, that the rigid systems of education began to break down. But for much of the Victorian era, the divide between the educated elite and the uneducated poor was a fundamental part of the societal structure. Education served as a powerful tool for maintaining the class distinctions that defined the time. Victorian education was deeply intertwined with the class system, reflecting and perpetuating the rigid hierarchies of the era. For the upper classes, education was about preparing the next generation for leadership and societal influence, while for the poor, it was largely inaccessible and limited to the basics necessary for survival. The divide between genders further complicated this system, with women's education geared toward domestic roles, while men were trained for public life. Education, or the lack of it, determined not only the future of the individual, but also the future of Victorian society as a whole, ensuring that class divisions remained firmly in place. Reflecting on Victorian society reveals a world that, though rooted in structure and stability, exacted a heavy toll on its citizens. The rigid expectations governing every aspect of life ensured that social order was maintained, but at the cost of personal freedom. From the moment one woke to the sound of the clock striking the hour to the final curtsy before bed, every movement, word, and glance was subject to scrutiny. In this tightly regulated society, individuals found themselves constantly performing for others, as reputation was more important than personal happiness. The pressure to conform, to be seen in the right way, and to uphold the family name overshadowed everything else. As a result, Victorian society created a world where true self-expression was stifled, and personal desires often had to be pushed aside in favor of upholding appearances. The legacy of this social performance, more than any other aspect, defined the essence of Victorian life. People were not simply judged by their character, but by their ability to adhere to an intricate web of expectations, whether it was the way one dressed, the timing of a social call, or the decorum maintained in conversation. Every interaction was a chance to either reinforce or ruin one's social standing. The obsession with status and outward appearance meant that how others perceived you became your identity, overshadowing any internal complexity or individualism. For the wealthy, this meant constant attention to detail, from the clothes they wore to the words they spoke, all aimed at maintaining their elite status. For the working class, it meant adhering to the more subtle codes of conduct, ensuring that no breach of behavior could be seen as a threat to their survival in a society that relied so heavily on social mobility. What makes Victorian society truly paradoxical is the way it blended extreme formality with the deep, unspoken desires for connection, emotional intimacy, and personal happiness. Underneath the layers of rigid decorum and social expectation, there was an inherent human longing for freedom. Yet, in a society where even courtship was managed with calculated precision, personal expression and emotional connection were often hidden beneath the surface. A couple's relationship could be dictated not by love, but by strategic alliances. While individuals were expected to repress their desires and emotions in favor of maintaining a flawless public facade, people had to suppress much of what made them human: intimacy, vulnerability, and spontaneous joy, because to show these feelings could lead to social ruin. These contradictions were not only exhausting, but were part of what made Victorian life so emotionally complex. Despite this, the rigidity of Victorian society was not wholly stifling. People adapted in their own ways, finding ways to subvert or work within the rules in order to make sense of their world. Courtship rituals, while highly formalized, still allowed for moments of connection, however restrained they might be. The home, even under the constant pressure to maintain appearances, became a place where people could find solace and companionship, albeit within the boundaries of what was socially acceptable. And though public life was dominated by appearance and status, private moments still offered avenues for personal expression and, in some cases, subversive acts of defiance. The Victorian paradox of formality and restraint fostered a delicate dance between public performance and private satisfaction, where the truth of one's feelings was often kept hidden, but never fully suppressed. In conclusion, the Victorian era was defined by a social structure that placed immense value on outward appearances and strict codes of conduct. The weight of these rules affected every facet of life, from the clothes one wore to the words one spoke, shaping a society where reputation and respectability determined one's worth. Behind the formal rituals and meticulous social performances, however, was a deep undercurrent of personal yearning. While the Victorian world may have been an era of social rigidity, it was also one where human beings found ways to navigate their desires, emotions, and relationships within the confines of an unyielding system. Ultimately, the legacy of Victorian society is one of immense social pressure, but also of resilience and adaptability in the face of an intricate web of rules and expectations. If you found this journey into Victorian society as fascinating as we did, don't forget to like, share, and comment below with your thoughts. Subscribe to Soft History Stories for more immersive historical narratives and get lost in the past with us. We'd love to hear your opinions and experiences, so drop a comment and let's keep the conversation going.